There is a particular kind of violence that occurs in the heavy, suffocating silence of the night, a subtle, microscopic shattering of the self that happens when the mind finally realizes it is no longer the master of its own internal kingdom. They didn't forget you. They buried you. There's a profound, almost terrifying distinction between the two that most people are too paralyzed to acknowledge. For forgetting is a passive erosion, a slow, natural fading of colors until the image is gone. But burial is a deliberate act of the will. It is a desperate, frantic attempt to hide a truth that is too heavy to carry in the light of day. They didn't lose the memory of your existence. They chose to enter it in the cold, damp soil of the unconscious, in that specific, dark corner of the mind where unfinished emotions are left to rot and eventually mutate into something unrecognizable. And that is exactly why they are starting to lose control of the very reality they tried so hard to protect. Because the psyche is not a graveyard. It is a living garden, and whatever is buried beneath the surface does not simply disappear into the void. It transforms, it waits, it distorts, it gains a life of its own, feeding on the darkness until it returns sharper, louder, and far more dangerous than it ever was when it walked the earth of their conscious mind. Forgetting someone is not an act of an eraser. It is an act of internal violence against the self. When they told themselves it was over, when they convinced themselves you no longer mattered, they were committing a psychological crime that the soul never truly forgives. They rehearsed their indifference like a script they hoped would eventually become their reality, practicing the coldness in their voice and the blankness in their eyes, waiting for the day they would finally believe their own lies. But the soul is not a collaborator in the ego's deceptions. Something deep inside them refused to cooperate. Something in the ancient, archetypal centers of their brain refused to obey the command to delete the resonance you left behind. This is the precise moment where the situation becomes perilous. Because the more they try to forget you, the more their subconscious began to mount a silent, relentless rebellion. Carl Jung understood this better than anyone. He called it repression. The mind's desperate, often futile attempt to push unacceptable feelings into the dark. But repression does not kill desire. It merely traps it in a pressurized chamber. And trapped emotions do not stay quiet. They build pressure slowly, silently, and relentlessly, like tectonic plates grinding against each other in the dark, waiting for the inevitable moment when the crust of the persona finally cracks. Most people do not see this process happening. They think obsession begins with a choice to pay attention, but real, soul-shattering obsession begins with the choice to avoid. It begins with the desperate need not to feel, with the frantic urge to push a memory away before it can fully form and demand a reckoning. That is exactly what they have been doing with you. Every time your name surfaced in their mind, they didn't just ignore it. They shut it down with a visceral, instinctive fear. Every time a memory of your voice or the specific way you laughed tried to breathe, they suffocated it with the weight of their own pride. Every time a feeling tried to rise toward the surface, they crushed it before it could reach the threshold of consciousness. But here's the fatal flaw in their design. The mind does not forget what the heart refuses to resolve. Closure is a myth that the ego tells itself to sleep at night. The soul only knows integration or fragmentation. Because they refused to integrate you, you fragmented within them. You became 1,000 jagged pieces of glass scattered throughout their internal landscape. Now you are no longer a person to them. You are a series of hauntings. You are a flash of a familiar voice in a quiet room that should be empty. You are a shadow of a presence in a crowded space where you couldn't possibly be. You are a sudden cold feeling in the pit of their stomach that they cannot explain but absolutely cannot escape. This is where the haunting becomes dangerous. Because fragments do not behave like orderly memories. They behave like triggers, unpredictable, intrusive, and entirely uncontrollable. One moment they believe they are fine. They are walking through their predictable, safe life, and then something small, something meaningless, sets the trap off. A specific song on the radio, the scent of rain on hot asphalt, a random word spoken by a stranger, and suddenly you are there again. Not as a polite thought, but as a physical force that demands to be reckoned with. If you can feel the weight of this invisible resonance vibrating in the air around you right now, type "I am the resonance" in the comments to anchor your presence in this space. They hate it. They hate the way you invade the sanctity of their mind without asking for permission. They hate how something they tried so hard to erase keeps finding its way back through the cracks in their armor. But more than anything, they hate that it still affects them, because that visceral reaction destroys the illusion they have spent so much energy building. It destroys the lie that they have moved on. It destroys the facade that they are in control of their own internal kingdom. It destroys the ultimate deception that you meant nothing, but the truth is written in the very energy they use to fight you. You do not fight something that doesn't matter. You do not suppress something that has no power. You do not run from something that isn't chasing you. And yet they have been running constantly, an internal marathon of avoidance, trying to outrun a ghost that lives inside their own neural pathways. That is the paradox of the repressed. The harder they try to escape you, the deeper you embed yourself into the fabric of their identity. The more they deny your existence, the more your absence begins to define them. The more they try to silence the memory of your name, the louder it echoes in the hollow spaces of their life. Most people do not understand that control is not found in suppression. Real control is only found in confrontation, and they have never once confronted what you actually made them feel. They never faced the intensity, the raw vulnerability, or the terrifying parts of themselves that only existed when you were around. They were too afraid of the person they became in your presence, someone who was actually alive. So, instead of facing the fire, they tried to extinguish it by burying it. But repression doesn't delete, it distorts. It twists something real and beautiful into something unstable and monstrous. And now they are starting to feel that distortion in ways they cannot explain. It comes in moments that make no sense, in emotional spikes that hit too hard to ignore, in a restlessness that no distraction can soothe. What was once buried is no longer staying still. It is moving, shifting, and evolving in the dark. What used to be a simple memory of a person is becoming something heavier, a psychological weight, a gravity that pulls at them every time they try to move forward. They are realizing that you don't just visit their mind, you linger there like a permanent resident. The worst part for them is the lack of understanding. They haven't connected the dots. They don't realize that every suppressed thought is resurfacing with more intensity than before, because the subconscious does not forget. It keeps a perfect celestial score. It waits with the patience of a mountain for the right moment to return everything they tried to ignore. And it returns it all at once with interest. When that moment comes, it won't ask for permission. It won't knock on the door of their consciousness. It will simply take over. And right now, as you hear these words, they are getting closer to that collapse than they realize. Something inside them is slipping. Their control is fraying. The distractions they once relied on, the work, the noise, the shallow relationships are no longer enough to drown out the silence where you reside. They thought distance would weaken the bond. They were wrong. Distance did not dilute the feeling. It concentrated it. It turned the emotion into a high-pressure gas trapped in a sealed chamber with no release valve. Now, it is no longer something they can casually push aside. It has become a psychological interruption they cannot stabilize. Most people assume that moving on is about replacing a person, but replacement only works when the original connection was fully processed and closed. You weren't. You were cut off mid-sentence, mid-impact, mid-awakening. This means their mind is stuck in a loop, forever trying to reach a conclusion that they denied themselves. Unfinished experiences do not fade into the past. They loop in the present until the brain is forced to resolve the tension. Every time they tried to connect with someone else, something felt off. Not because the other person lacked value, but because the emotional imprint you left was never cleared from the slate. Everything in their life has become a silent comparison. They measure every look, every touch, and every conversation against the resonance they felt with you. And it is exhausting them. No one else triggers the same intensity. No one else disrupts their identity the same way. No one else makes them feel that strange, terrifying mix of power and surrender that you did. And now, in the quiet hours of 3 a.m., they are starting to ask the questions they were never supposed to ask. If you are ready to stop being the ghost in someone else's mind and start being the architect of your own destiny, type soul connection to claim your power. Why does this still matter? Why can't they just let it go? Why does something they tried so hard to forget feel more real than the life that is standing right in front of them? These questions are the beginning of the end for their denial. Awareness is a slow-acting poison to the ego's lies. It begins to dismantle the deception that they are unaffected. The subconscious doesn't lie. It reveals the truth in fragments, then in patterns, until the patterns become an undeniable map. They catch themselves thinking about you not when they are lonely, but when they are busy, when they should be most in control. This is what unsettles them most, the realization that you have become automatic. You are no longer a thought they choose to have, you are a part of their internal structure. What operates beneath awareness has more power than anything we can consciously manage, because we cannot argue with it. We cannot reason away a resonance that exists in our very nervous system. Every time they feel you, it weakens their sense of self-mastery. They say they are fine, but their eyes tell a different story. They say they have moved on, but their reactions to the world are still shaped by your absence. Real loss of control is never explosive. It is a series of quiet contradictions. It is the slow realization that you are living in two realities, the one you show the world and the one that is actively being shaped by a memory you tried to kill. Eventually, one side must break. The more they resist acknowledging you, the more extreme their internal reactions become. What was once a passing thought has mutated into a fixation. What was once a manageable memory has become an overwhelming intrusion. They don't know how to stop the cycle because they never learned how to be honest about the depth of the impact. Repressed desire returns disguised stronger, more demanding, and more distorted. You are no longer just a person from their past. You have become a psychological force in their present, a presence that doesn't need logic to justify itself. They are starting to realize that the fighting is useless. Avoiding, ignoring, and suppressing have only made the connection stronger. They are trapped in a loop where the more they try to push you away, the more persistent you become. It is not a coincidence. It is the mind demanding a resolution to the tension. But resolution requires honesty, and honesty is the one thing that will destabilize the entire narrative of their life. If they are honest, they have to admit that you are the only thing that ever made them feel real. They feel that moment of collapse, getting closer that instant where the walls fall and they can't unsee the truth anymore. Once the truth surfaces, it reshapes everything. It changes the way they see their past, their present, and their future. They are standing on the edge of that realization right now, no longer completely asleep, but terrified of waking up. Something is breaking through the barriers they built. And when it finally reaches the surface, it will hit with a force that they are entirely unprepared for. This was never about forgetting you. It was about the cost of denying a soul-level connection. Denial always comes with a price, and they are just beginning to feel the weight of the bill. It is no longer subtle. What they buried is starting to breathe on its own. And that is what terrifies them most. Not that they remember you, but that they feel you again with an invasive, uncontrollable power. Repressed emotions don't return as soft memories. They return as raw, immediate experiences. They return as if time never passed, as if the connection never ended. They are caught in a present tense haunting. Time only heals what is processed. Everything else, time merely preserves in a state of high-frequency intensity. This is why you don't come back weaker. You come back exactly the same as the day they tried to erase you. Their mind can no longer distinguish between the past they walked away from and the present they are struggling to survive. You are not just someone they knew, you are something they are reliving. But here is the most unsettling part of their journey. They are starting to crave the haunting. How do you explain missing the very thing you tried to destroy? How do you justify wanting the chaos that destabilizes your life? They are realizing that the version of themselves that existed with you was the only version that was truly alive. Without you, everything else feels muted, flat, and incomplete. So they keep returning to you mentally, emotionally, and compulsively. Each revisit deepens the imprint. Each thought makes the loop harder to break. If you have finally recognized that your value is not defined by their ability to acknowledge it, type "I am whole" to anchor your evolution. They're no longer trying to forget you. They're trying to understand why they can't. And that shift changes the entire game. The mind has stopped avoiding and started digging. It is uncovering desires they couldn't control and vulnerabilities they couldn't hide. It is revealing that this was never one-sided. It was never insignificant. It was never something they could just move on from. They knew it from the start, but they chose the safety of denial over the danger of the truth. But safety is a trap when it's built on a lie. The consequences of their silence are becoming unpredictable. Their thoughts are becoming intrusive. Their control is slipping in ways they cannot explain to a soul. How do they tell the world that the person they tried to erase has taken over their mind again? How do they admit their control was a facade? They are reaching the breaking point where denial versus desire can no longer coexist. One must die so the other can live. They can feel the moment getting closer when everything they've been holding back will break through at once. No filters, no suppression, no escape. It will be overwhelming, consuming, and impossible to ignore. They didn't lose control because of you. They lost control because of what you uncovered inside them. You didn't plant the intensity. You merely revealed the fire that was already there. You were the mirror they weren't ready to look into. And once you see your true self in the eyes of another, you can never go back to pretending you are the mask. This confrontation is tearing through every excuse they ever built. The hardest part was never letting you go. The hardest part was admitting what you actually meant to them. It was admitting how much of their identity was tied to the way you saw them. Now the truth is crashing in violently, relentlessly, with no regard for their comfort. They are facing the parts of themselves they can't put back to sleep. They tried to forget you because you were too much. You were too intense, too real, and too destabilizing for the small, safe life they were comfortable living. They rejected you to protect the illusion, but you don't erase power by rejecting it. You internalize it. You become shaped by the very thing you refuse to face. Now they see how much of their inner world is still carrying you. Forgetting you is no longer an option, because forgetting you would mean forgetting a vital part of themselves. They are standing at a psychological crossroads. One path leads to the honesty of integration, and the other leads to a permanent fracture. But they cannot go back. Once the truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. You are a turning point, a fracture in the stability they thought was permanent. Now they must decide whether to confront the awakening or let the conflict consume them. Ignoring it is no longer an option. Control is no longer an option. The collapse has already begun, and it is irreversible. They tried to forget you, but in doing so, they lost the one thing they were trying to save: themselves. Now, they have to live with the truth of what you awakened, and the silence of the night will never be empty again. Type "sacred gravity" to signal your trust in the divine timing of this awakening. Subscribe now to anchor this wisdom and stay aligned with the path of your highest self. The universe is listening.